The rule of law involves a great deal more than simply passing a piece of legislation and then rounding up and punishing every wrongdoer you can find. Far above and beyond the coercive function of law is the role of law in setting a standard. In 1991, when we passed the Anti-Discrimination Act, we were very well aware of the fact that we were shifting the social goalposts. We set out deliberately and consciously with the Anti-Discrimination Act to establish a new normative standard for civilised behaviour in our democracy. The laws of a society are the means by which that society announces itself and defines itself and describes itself, not only to its own citizens, but to the rest of the world and indeed to history. And when we passed the Anti-Discrimination Act, we were conscious of the fact that we were defining a new society. We were establishing a new normative standard which we wanted people to follow and aspire to. And although there have been advances in social inclusion since the Anti-Discrimination Act, the Anti-Discrimination Act was the necessary precondition for those advances. And essentially they were footnotes to the events of 1991. Logically, the next step of comparable effect is going to be the establishment of a Charter of Human Rights, along perhaps the lines of the New Zealand model.
Well, it's 20 years since the Anti-Discrimination Bill was passed in this House. And there's no doubt that things have changed. 20 years is a long time ago. But the principles of anti-discrimination, or making sure there isn't discrimination in our community, still hold firm and are very important. I think they're very important on a number of lines, but particularly the more vulnerable people in our community, those less likely to be able to look after themselves when it comes to work or legal proceedings. And I think we as a nation in those 20 years have become much more realistic when we look at the issues of discrimination and how best they can be handled. If there's one thing I would do in the future, I think we still have issues of discrimination against women, women of all kinds, but particularly immigrant women, migrant women, who often find themselves in situations, particularly in the workplace, where they're not well represented, they're not well looked after, they work too hard and they're paid too little. This is improving, but I think there is a long way to go. I also think that even in some situations now, women do not have equal pay for equal work. Women are still discriminated quite openly at times when it comes to gaining positions of real power in this state and nation. 20 years ago, actually, I became the first woman to lead a political party in Queensland, and the first Deputy Premier and Treasurer of Queensland, and the first Treasurer in Australia. This is only 20 years ago. Now, women have come a long way, particularly in my profession of politics. We now have a lot more women in high positions. We now have a female Prime Minister in Australia for the first time. That doesn't mean to say that women still have to work, I think, a lot harder, prove themselves a lot more to gain these positions and to gain trust of their fellow men and also of the community. So while we've made great strides, I think, in the last 20 years, we've still got quite a way to go.
If there was one thing
that
that I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive,
it would be
have everyone understand each other's cultures.
I'd love Queenslanders to join a social group.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to include regional Queensland. Queensland has a vast geographic spread, And many people in those remote communities, the Gulf countries, up in Mornington Island and so forth, are not being included and not being heard, and resources therefore are very scarce on the ground because they don't have a voice in Queensland.
If there was one thing I could do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, I would ask people to worry less about doing the politically correct thing and worry more about doing the right thing.
Ask yourself, would I be in the running for the Best and Fairest Player award about the way I treat people? If you're not a contender, perhaps think of doing an act of kindness to the first person that you see who needs it, every day for the rest of your life.
If there's one thing that the Commission will continue to do to build a fairer and inclusive Queensland, it will be to continue to work with individuals and their local communities to create opportunities for human rights to flourish in their lives, in the small places that are important to them and in their communities.
If there was one thing I would do to make Queensland more fair and inclusive, it would be to have a conversation with all Queenslanders about what each and every one of us can do to create a community where human rights can flourish.